Nur eine Frage. Ein Podcast der ZEIT.
N1F, wie wir auch sagen, gibt es als Podcast, als Video, als Textinterview und wir verschicken ein Newsletter. Das alles kann man sehen bei www.zeit.de/N1F. Und jetzt geht's los. Welcome to Just One Question. I'm Jochen Wegner, ZEIT's Editor-in-Chief. On this show I ask yes or no questions that sound simple but are hard to answer. And I put them to the best expert we can find anywhere in the world. Today's question is life just a matter of chance? Life as we know it on Earth today, according to everything serious scientists discussed, just came into being on its own. So how can something this complex simply arise? When I look at my kids or at a whale or a bird, it's hard to imagine they came about just through a chain of coincidences that took a couple of billion years. So is life really just a matter of chance? The best person to help us answer is Nobel laureate Jack Szostak. Professor Szostak is a Canadian-American biologist with Polish roots. He teaches at the University of Chicago and previously at Harvard Medical School. He has researched chromosomal recombination during meiosis and the function of telomeres, the caps at the end of chromosomes. And for his work, Jack received the 2009 Nobel Prize. He shifted his focus of research many years ago in the early 90s, late 80s, and concentrated on RNA and the origin of life on Earth. And just last year, he published a wonderful book, Is Earth an Exception? And so thank you very much for being here. May I ask you one question? Is life just a coincidence?
Yes, that's a very interesting question. Hard to answer. I could say yes for some reasons, no for other reasons.
No would be the much more interesting answer.
Well, it's no in the sense that the emergence of life followed the laws of physics and chemistry.
Yes.
So there's nothing, in a sense, accidental about all of the individual processes. But you could say, well, if you need a sort of long chain of unlikely events in the end, maybe the emergence of life is, in a sense, an accident. But even there, we don't know, because we don't know if the emergence of life is something that is very easy, would almost be inevitable, or if it's something very rare, in which case you could call it an accident.
Yeah. Let's start from scratch. So I'm sorry to ask these basic questions, but what is life? I learned something really different from what scientists tell me today, what the definition of life should be. Maybe you should answer this question first.
Well,
so what's the definition of life?
Yeah. See, that I don't really like that question, because we use the word life to mean so many different things, right?
Yes.
If we're talking about biology, the hallmark of biology is Darwinian evolution. But there are other systems, even computer systems, evolve in that sense. So to me, what's much more interesting than trying to make an ironclad definition is to understand the pathway, right? Everything from planet formation to what early environments were like, how a bunch of chemicals became alive, how that led to the life that we see all around us now. That understanding that whole pathway is to me is the interesting thing. And different people will say at different places on that pathway, well, before this there was no life, after this things were alive. And you might have different opinions there. I don't think it really helps us very much.
Yeah. Is it like if I see life, I know that it's life, or is it?
Well, if you see something biological, like as we were saying, a whale, a butterfly, children, it's obvious that's life. But when you get down to simpler systems, closer to the origin of life, it becomes a kind of a gray area in a sense.
So there's something going on with replication that should be one of the cornerstones of life, right? So if I'm alive, I'm able to replicate, so make copies of myself, right?
Yeah, but there are lots of things, this is one of these classic kind of stupid things, right? Is a mule alive? It can't replicate. There are lots of sterile animals or old people who can't replicate. It's ridiculous, right? It's just an example of how trying to pin down a definition is actually, in this case, not that helpful.
Is a virus alive?
Oh, God.
I'm sorry.
That drives me nuts, right? It depends on living things for its ability to replicate. It's a parasite of life. I mean, again, it's one of those things that people like to get stuck on debating, but it doesn't really get you anywhere in understanding how things work.
Okay, but if we want to find out what life is, how it came into being, we have to have an idea so where we are heading, right? So maybe we could start there. What are the ideas, and you're famous for all your research in that area. What are the basic ideas? How did life emerge on Earth?
Yeah, so that's what we're trying to understand in my lab. It's what I've been kind of focused on for at least the last 25
You don't know what it is, but you're doing a lot of research in how it came into being.
All of biological life on our planet is cells, right? And cells have some common characteristics. They have genetic material that gets replicated, so you can pass on information from generation to generation. And every cell has an envelope, a cell membrane that keeps the inside kind of distinct from the rest of the environment. And so we're trying to think of, okay, well, what's the simplest kind of system like that could emerge spontaneously from the chemistry of the early Earth? So we call that really simple kind of cell a protocell, a primitive cell membrane, some probably very small bits of genetic information, which we think is probably composed of RNA. And then somehow, and this is the bigger problem, the cell with its membrane has to grow and divide, so you have daughter cells, and the genetic material has to get copied, replicated, just using chemistry and physics, right? Because at the beginning, there were no enzymes. I think one thing where people get kind of bogged down in definitions is people look at the biology that we see around us, and there are many common features, but they're evolved properties of life. They weren't around at the very beginning. So I think we have to be careful about what would you call kind of the simplest, earliest beginnings of life, and then distinguish that from properties that evolved over time.
What's your favorite idea of how life started at the very early beginning? I mean, you wrote a book about it, basically. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit about that. So what's your idea about the starting point?
One of the things that I love, because it's a little bit ironic, is that the best chemical starting point for making eventually all the building blocks of biology, that best chemical starting point is cyanide.
So right? the poison.
Yes. Yeah, it's not good for us, but it's a great way, it turns out it's a great way to get life started.
Right.
So it's a compound that stores, in a sense, a lot of energy in its structure. And so it's a good starting point for a whole series of chemical reactions that give you more complicated molecules. That is not something I've worked on myself very much, a little bit recently. I think the best work in that area comes from my colleague John Sutherland in the UK. And he's traced out pathways essentially starting from cyanide, going through many steps up to the nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA. That's a big part of the puzzle. The other part is the molecules that make primitive membranes. And that's something that is not well studied so far. I mean, we have a few ideas, but that's an area that really needs a lot more work. But okay, if you're willing to accept that, okay, there were environments on the early Earth where you could, concentrate materials on the surface. You can also get energy from the sun, ultraviolet radiation. You can build up the building blocks of RNA. You can make fatty acids, the components of membranes. Then we're at a good starting point to think about more complicated systems evolving. And what we're interested in are self-assembly processes. So if you take fatty acids, like oleic acid, the fatty acid that comes from olive oil, right? You just shake it up in water, so not too acidic, not too basic. It'll spontaneously assemble into membranes that are kind of like our cell membranes. I mean, it's beautiful to watch. The structures that are made are incredibly
But it's just
beautiful.
chemistry and physics
It's
doing
just
this little.
chemistry and physics, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, same thing with RNA. That's more complicated chemistry and physics for sure. But with the right inputs of energy and the right chemistry, we know you can make chains of RNA. We basically know how to copy them to make a double-stranded, a double helix product. We think we know how to go through cycles and copy the copies. So I think we're close to having, an understanding, at least an outline of the whole process.
So can we zoom in a little bit how this should really have started? So what are the environments? We're talking about 4 billion years before our time, maybe. So around that. How can you imagine the Earth at that age? It was really young. It was nearly liquid. It was spinning fast and stuff like that, and bombarded by all kinds of stuff from space. So hostile environment.
That's what people think of immediately because you imagine these huge impactors coming in, smashing into the Earth. Obviously, when that happens, that's not good.
Bad for the little bubbles
Yeah,
to
but
self-assemble.
actually, the largest of those events are quite rare. There are lots of smaller impactors, but actually, the environment might have been quite calm most of the time. Probably millions, tens of millions of years between really large impacts. Those large impacts actually do something useful. We think this is a fairly new theory, but the big ones have an iron core. When that smashes into the Earth and gets vaporized, that iron reacts with water, releases hydrogen. You have an atmosphere. It affects the chemistry of the atmosphere. So now you have things like hydrogen, methane, maybe ammonia, a little bit of water. All the carbon dioxide gets reduced to things like methane. And that's a great environment for making cyanide, which can then rain out to the surface of the Earth. There's, a lot of modeling, a lot of details to be worked out. It seems like a reasonably plausible theory for how to get the starting materials you need. But then there's a puzzle, right? Because you can make cyanide in different ways. When it comes to the surface, dissolved in rainwater, it's very dilute. And that's not good, right? Because if it comes into a lake or a pond or the ocean as a dilute solution, it's not going to do anything interesting. It's going to hydrolyze. So that was a big puzzle for years and years and years. And then my colleagues, John Grotzinger, Dimitar Sasolov, and also John Sutherland, kind of figured out that actually, if you're in an environment that is, for example, an impact crater or a volcanic environment, what we see today is there's a lot of fractured rock. There's a source of heat underneath that drives the circulation of water through this fractured rock. It comes up to the surface. It brings ions, things like iron, dissolved in that water. And that does something amazing. That dissolved iron reacts with dissolved cyanide, and it makes a complex that's very stable and which could accumulate over thousands of years, sort of in sediments that form at the bottom of, say, a lake. And now we've gone from something that's really puzzling, like this dilute solution of cyanide that's kind of useless, to now we have a scenario where you could build up a reservoir of this material over thousands of years. And so there's been a lot of work trying to understand exactly how that could happen. What kinds of environments do you need, more precisely defined? So it's been a very fruitful question to investigate. And then you say, okay, well, now we have this reservoir of cyanide locked up with iron. Then what? You have to get the cyanide off of the iron, right? So how do you do that? Basically, you have to cook it. You need something like a lava flow or, heat from magma from underneath that's going to process that material at high temperatures. Okay? That will release the cyanide and some related chemicals that are exactly what you need to go on to the next chemical step. And so now we come back to something you were mentioning earlier, right? Those chemicals can in turn get processed to intermediates. Some of those can build up, they can crystallize out, form what we call an organic mineral that could again build up over time. Every reservoir of material like that has to last, has to not get washed away, blown away, has to last until conditions are right for the next set of chemical reactions. And so each one of those steps might be quite rare. And if there's a whole bunch of those steps going from cyanide all the way to RNA and life, could be incredibly rare. Right? On the other hand, we had hundreds of millions of years, and we know there's billions of planets, probably pretty much like Earth in our galaxy. So maybe it was inevitable for it to happen here, or inevitable to happen somewhere in the universe. This is what we don't know. This comes back to your question about whether life is an accident.
This sounds really improbable. So for a lay person, I learned while preparing for, while talking to you, that the actual time span when life should have evolved is rather short compared to the 4 billion years, right? So the first steps should have taken some hundreds of millions of years, but not billions of years, right?
Yeah. Do you consider hundreds of millions of years a short period of time?
Compared to the age of the universe, maybe.
Yeah, but a lot can happen in hundreds of millions of years, especially if you consider that, it's a big planet, right? There's lots of places for things to happen. So I think it's fascinating. From what we know now, it's like the individual chemical steps all look easy, inevitable in a sense. But it's this chain of events that, to me, is the most interesting and puzzling thing.
And then we get, so we need some membrane. Why do we need the membrane? We need a closed environment because everything dissolves and nothing can stay in shape without something protecting the protocell or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, exactly. To me, the most important aspect of having this kind of membrane compartment is that the molecules inside are held together. And so if you have RNA molecules inside and they're replicating, then when that protocell divides, they'll each get the contents of the parental cell. If there's no membrane, you might have replication going on, but everything would just float away and get all mixed up. And here we have to think about Darwinian evolution, right? What does that really mean? It means if you find a sequence or a mutation in a sequence that does something good, it has to help itself. And so if you have this happening inside compartments that are growing and dividing, then a sequence that does some useful reaction, say an RNA molecule that catalyzes a useful reaction, it can benefit, it can help its own replication, its own propagation. If you didn't have that membrane, it might help all of its neighbors, but then, you wouldn't be able to evolve.
But how did the first protocells divide and replicate themselves? Would the mechanism even be?
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. It turns out that might be the easiest part of the whole
really?
thing. Yes. We've actually found several different ways that can happen. most of what we do, it's not very visual, but working with these membrane vesicles that are, stained with beautiful dyes, it's wonderful to watch. And so basically we can form these vesicles, add in more material, so essentially feeding them with more fatty acids. That material will go into the membrane that already exists, right? So its surface area will expand. And if that surface grows faster than the volume, the surface can fluctuate. And those shape changes, you can see them happening in the microscope, and you can just bud off smaller daughter cells. Very simple. We've also found other pathways that are more complicated, but yeah, it can happen pretty easily.
But it has to happen millions and billions of times to kind of have an life.
That's an interesting point, right? Because sure, if the conditions change, so this stops happening, okay, that doesn't sound good. You could probably start and stop a number of times as long as you don't wait too long. I mean, this is the question. When does life become robust enough to withstand, the fact that maybe its local environment got wiped out, dried out, blew away, whatever? We think these things could get quickly spread around the planet. Just they dry out, dust will blow around. Some of them will land in another nice environment, do some more replication, evolve to be a little bit more robust. But yeah, how likely is that? How hard is it? How long would it take? These are all great questions.
So you mentioned RNA several times before.
Yeah.
So everybody knows what RNA is today. When I was at school, it was like the other stuff around DNA going on there. It's not important at all. So this huge changed this picture. Huge changed this picture
of biology, right?
Yeah. And so, but what's the role? So obviously RNA is the key substance we need for the transfer of information in these early stages. There was no DNA at all, right?
Probably not. Yeah. It actually, this is another thing that people are arguing about or trying to figure out is, that early genetic material could have been some mixture of RNA and DNA. I think it probably was actually just RNA, but there's some, there's a lot of these things we're still trying to figure out.
But you have to explain how RNA can kind of copy itself without having all the other mechanisms I know from school.
Well, actually, let me first just say one of the strongest pieces of evidence for why we think RNA was the original important molecule in early life, and that is all cells have these sort of tiny molecular machines called ribosomes, which is where all of our proteins are made, right? And ribosomes are built with RNA and proteins. But if you look at the part of the ribosome where the chemical bonds in peptides and proteins, where those peptide bonds are made, it's all surrounded by RNA. Okay, so RNA is catalyzing the synthesis of every protein in every cell on our planet. So I think the only logical deduction from that is that RNA came first and later on evolved the ability to make proteins. Okay, so we think there's this early stage in the evolution of life that was dominated by RNA. And we know that RNA can act as an enzyme, can also carry and transmit genetic information. Probably, everybody now knows about the COVID virus, which is an RNA virus, right? So its genetic information is carried in RNA. But at the beginning of life, we think there were very, very, very small bits of RNA that replicated, not as in biology now, where replication's catalyzed by enzymes. There were no enzymes. There were not even any RNA enzymes at the beginning. So we think that early replication, again, was just driven by chemistry and physics.
So before we get deeper into that, and I understand your answer to my question, I was asking myself also basic kids question, did life just evolve once on Earth? If it's so probable and it only took some 100 million years. Why not having the same process going on somewhere else, doing something really different or exactly the same?
Yeah.
How do you see this?
All these things are possible, and we don't know. We don't know if life was popping up all over the place and, in different places on the planet, competing with each other. The main thing that we do know is that all life on the planet now traces back to a common ancestor, right? We call it that LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. But that was a cell that was much like a modern bacterium. It had DNA, it had RNA, it had ribosomes, had proteins. It was highly evolved.
The bacterium, somewhere some billion years ago, was mother and father of everything that followed.
Everything that followed. The problem is, it's very hard to figure out what came before that last common ancestor, right? We know there was probably, at least hundreds of millions of years, maybe a billion years of evolution, and trying to pick apart and deduce what happened during that process is extremely challenging.
There's no evidence on this planet about this first phase, right?
There's no physical evidence. We have no, like, the earliest fossils, convincing fossils of life, already look as complicated as bacteria. Because of plate tectonics and subduction, almost all of the rocks from early Earth's history are gone. We have evidence from DNA sequences of modern life, and so tracing back those sequences, we can deduce a lot about that last common ancestor. And there are some genes in that common ancestor that were duplicated, and so we can deduce back a little bit earlier, but it becomes harder and harder the further back you want to go.
So we will never know if there have been hundreds of millions of versions of life before that point in time.
Right. It's quite possible that if it was easy for life to get started, it might have been happening many times. Maybe most of the time it got wiped out. A meteor impact destroyed some area where there was life. And maybe life had to emerge many times in order for finally one of those emergences lasted, spread around the Earth, evolved to become robust, and evolved to the point where it was impossible to eradicate it.
And so we just started with a little bacterium at the beginning of life itself. And then it's really easy. So from there to my kids, it's just, from there to Jack, it's just like that?
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, once you have the complexity of, you have protein synthesis, you have DNA replication, you have very strong process of evolution going on, right? And so life is going to become more complex as it adapts to different environments. It evolves to survive under a broader range of conditions. So I think, in a sense, it's inevitable for life to become more complicated over time as it becomes better adapted. On the other hand, you could ask, well, why did it take so long? Right? Not very much happened for almost 2 billion years, until we started to have multicellular life and things that could crawl around and become predators and prey. And probably the cause of that delay is geochemistry, the fact that the early atmosphere had no oxygen. We had to wait for photosynthesis to generate oxygen for a long, long time, and build up in the atmosphere. And for 1 billion years, that oxygen's probably being consumed by other chemical processes. So again, something that people are trying to figure out.
I don't dare to ask, but so there's another step, which is kind of intelligent life, which started really late in the story.
Right.
So what's your view on that?
Well, I guess my view on that is so again, we don't know if it's inevitable or a rare event. But I think what biologists have maybe only relatively recently started to emphasize is what are all the stages in the evolution of more and more intelligent behavior, things that would lead to not just awareness of the environment, but self-awareness. I think the progression is super interesting. And maybe if I was just starting out now, I would be studying something like that.
Actually, the first podcast we published with N1F was with Anil Seth from the University of Sussex, who's doing exactly that kind of research. How does self-awareness evolve? And he thinks, it's his theory, that he's one of the most cited experts in that field. He thinks that it's deeply connected to life itself. So knowing that you exist and being able to reflect your own existence seems to be connected to life in a way. So it's an evolutionary thing that evolves.
Yeah,
That's his opinion, right?
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense to me that it's an evolutionary thing, that the simpler stages of life, right? You begin to sense the environment and respond in an appropriate way. And then as life becomes more complicated, you start to have neurons and then brains, more elaborate sensing of the environment. I do think that at some point, sensing your internal state is also important for survival and for propagation. I don't think we understand all of those steps, but I think that's a super interesting thing to be thinking about and working on.
I know that you published a lot of papers about this and wrote about this in your book. If you think about Earth as being in the context of the universe, we had another issue of this podcast asking, will we ever find aliens? Which is deeply connected to what we are talking about. What's your opinion on that? So if you had to guess, if you had to kind of bet in the UK.
People ask me this all the time. But whenever I give a public lecture these days, I ask...
What about aliens?
Yeah, well, I ask you, do you think life is common in the universe?
Yeah, but it's a simple but complicated question.
It is, right. Most people think life is common out there on other planets, orbiting other stars. But there's definitely also a lot of people who raise their hands when I asked, well, how many people think life is rare? Life is so complicated, right? And a lot of people think that it's so hard to get to life for, maybe for different reasons, that we might be the only place in the universe that has life. And so then people say, okay, but what do you think, right? And I always say, well, the reason of doing the work that I'm doing is to try to figure this out, try to get at least some clue as to whether it's easy or hard for life to emerge. And I just don't know. So as a scientist, I'm very comfortable with saying, I don't know. I don't feel like I have to have an opinion or a bet or a bias before I, get the answer.
Let me try again. So is it a 50-50 distribution? So you really do not know? There's no information there.
Okay, I'll give you a little bit here, right? So there are many steps along the chemical pathway to life that we had no idea, right? They just like, okay, this step is such a mystery, it just seems impossible. But then when you actually understand it, you realize, what could have happened. Okay, it's gone from looking impossible to seeming inevitable or super easy. And that's happened many times. So that kind of, it pushes me to think that, well, maybe the whole process is not that hard. Maybe life is common. But as we were talking about quite a bit, there's a lot of steps, and if all the steps are rare, the overall probability might be astronomically low.
But it's the universe.
It's a big universe. That's why we need this collaboration with our friends in astronomy, like my colleague Mary Olivia, who I wrote this book with. half of astronomy now is an effort to detect signs of life around exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars. If we had one convincing example of an independent origin of life, that would totally change the picture, right? That would tell us, okay, it's not an incredibly rare and difficult process.
But do we really know what we have to look for, because we do not even dare to define what life is?
Well, we know that we need to look for a change, for some aspect of the atmosphere of another planet that would be caused by biology acting over a long period of time. So like on our planet, it's biology that's responsible for the oxygen in the atmosphere, right? Now, again, it's not so simple because there's other ways to get atmospheres that have oxygen. But if you find something that has, a lot of oxygen, maybe also a lot of methane, again, something that by itself is not clear-cut signal, because methane can be made both by geology or atmospheric chemistry or by biology. So we need not just one piece of evidence. We need a whole lot of factors. We need to know a lot about the planet we're looking at, about the nature of its atmosphere, to try to deduce what we're seeing is something that has to be caused by biology, or could just again be a result of chemistry and physics.
I was asking myself, so what you describe is we are looking for twin Earths, in my simple words.
Yeah.
So like twin life, like mirror versions of this planet, right? And the mechanisms. Could it be that there are totally other, so forms of life that work totally different but do the same thing, like replicating, passing information in time and stuff like that? Can you imagine other mechanisms that would work?
It's a super interesting question. We debate about this a lot in my field. So one point of view is that the chemistry, say you're starting from cyanide, right? The chemical steps seem to take you towards RNA. There are some alternatives to RNA that are similar. We've looked at a few of those in my lab. And even one that looks easier to make doesn't work in the replication chemistry.
Can you mention the substance?
It's called TNA instead of RNA. It has a sugar that's a little bit simpler. It's a 4-carbon sugar instead of the 5-carbon ribose. But, it's we can't really prove that there isn't some alternative, some other kind of nucleic acid that might work, that might form in a somewhat different environment. And of course, the question gets even more difficult if you want to think of something very, very different, like a different solvent, say not life in something other than water. My personal view is that those extreme alternatives are extremely unlikely. But, there's a bias, right? In the field, we've been trying to understand, how did we get to the life that we have? And so that's where 99% of the effort has gone. The amount of effort that's gone into exploring alternatives is very small. So I think that's a big challenge to the whole field of chemistry, is to explore all the alternatives and try to come up with other ways of getting to replicating evolving life.
Could it happen that we already built new forms of life in computers like this? Could it be that there are little programs replicating? Well, you can code stuff that replicates itself. It's a basic paradigm in computer science. Is there something interesting going on inside of computers for someone interested in life?
Absolutely. There are people have been doing this actually for quite a long time, writing programs called genetic algorithms. Basically a computer program that can be copied, or I don't know if you can really say that it copies itself, but can copy with mistakes, mutations.
Which is important. We didn't mention it before. So there has to be mistakes to have evolution, right?
That's right. That's right. And every now and then, one of those mistakes might actually make the program work better, just like in biology. And you can see that. So there are people who are actually using these genetic algorithms to study the process of evolution, try to understand, well, what kinds of mistakes are helpful? Are there evolutionary strategies that make evolution work more efficiently or faster? So yeah, it's become a fascinating tool for studying the process of evolution itself.
Well, one obvious question would be these days, will we have AI systems that replicate themselves and define a new form of life, even intelligent life, maybe?
I don't see any reason in principle why not. It raises a lot of interesting and sometimes scary questions about the future of computer life. This is my colleague Mario Livio, my co-author on this book. He went into that in some depth, actually.
And well, maybe one last door we have to open. I had the pleasure to talk to Demis Hassabis some time ago about his current project.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting because, well, obviously there's a kind of revolution going on in your field, and you have kind of AI methods that work really well in predicting proteins. And the next layer would be, can't we do, well, a new kind of science with machines, which reflects biology in a totally new way? Would it be possible that we find an answer to the question how life came into being with these concepts, or is this a silly idea?
Well, it's not a silly idea. I guess personally, I'm a little bit skeptical that it will just reveal the answer. It's a useful tool. You know, the parts of our research that are starting to involve machine learning. You know, the AlphaFold project was revolutionary for people who study proteins.
Mm-hmm.
But it's important to recognize that even that has huge limitations, right? There's little or no physics built into the model, so it's hard to see how proteins dynamically change shape. That's become a new frontier of research. Lots of people are trying to have an equivalent of that kind of protein structure prediction that would work for RNA. And the problem there is we don't have the same kind of huge database of structures for the AI programs to learn from. So it's progressing, but more slowly. And then when you get down to the level of, say, the series of chemical reactions that led to the building blocks of life, I think machine learning will help with modeling quantum chemistry, modeling chemical reactions. I'm not sure it's going to tell us what the right reactions to think about are. I think there's still a huge importance for just human creativity and thinking of the right questions to ask.
Sorry, I have to open one last door, which is we didn't mention a very strange property of life on Earth, which is the orientation of the molecules. So in my simple words, so homochirality.
Yeah.
You have to explain. But it's really a wonder in itself when you talk about the chemistry of life. And it's really, I have no idea how this happens. As a physicist, you sit there and think, how can that happen? But you have to explain.
People have been thinking about this for a long time. It's such an interesting problem. So the molecules of life, from amino acids to nucleotides, even the more complex lipids, they come in basically in two forms, right? They can be in a right-handed or left-handed form. So if you have a certain kind of molecule and you look at its mirror image, right? So that would be chemically identical except for being a mirror image. In biology, all of, say, the nucleotides, the building blocks of RNA and DNA, are one mirror image only. We don't see both right and left-handed forms. So then the question is, well, how did that happen, right? And in fact, it's even worse than that, because we know from experiments that were done by my friend Jerry Joyce a long, long time ago, if you have a mixture of the right and left-handed forms of nucleotides, that's a disaster. You can't, if you make a polymer where you have right and left all mixed up, you can't replicate it. The whole chemistry breaks down. So somehow we know there had to be a way to get just one of those mirror image forms early on, a physical process. People have thought of all kinds of different theories. There's a new model that's come out just in the last year, work done by my colleague at Harvard, Dimitar Sasolov, and his former student, Furkan Oztur. They figured out a way. So if you have a magnetized surface in a magnetic field, that is actually a chiral environment. It's you would have two mirror image forms. And in that chiral environment, you can selectively crystallize out one of the two mirror image forms of a compound. Is that the answer? I think it's the best theory yet, but again, as always, it raises more questions. There's more work to do.
This is so crazy that it's hard to there's no reason why nature should be left-handed or right-handed at all. So the probability is 50-50 that it's 50-50. Left or right?
Yes.
So this is really strange. And now another interesting question would be, can we design organisms that are the other way around? So where the whole chemistry works in the other direction, which sounds silly for lay people, but which is an important field in, scientific discussions. And I was wondering, because you signed a very important paper about this, we should stop doing research in that area. So as long as we do not know what happens if we design little organisms that work the other way around. Why is that?
If we were able to build a mirror image form of a bacterium that was, robust enough to survive out in the environment, there are good reasons for thinking that might be extremely disastrous, right? Because you can imagine that, one of the most straightforward things, if such an organism was growing in the environment, it would be completely resistant to infection by bacterial viruses, bacteriophage. And so it would have a huge advantage over normal bacteria. Right? So that would disrupt the bacterial ecosystem. If it was robust enough to infect humans, animals, even plants, it would be resistant. It would not be recognized by our immune system or by the immune systems of other organisms. And so even though it might have many disadvantages in terms of nutrients, it would have a huge advantage in terms of the immune response. So we think, we just think that the experiment should not be done. Right? People shouldn't make something. So there's a lot of research that should be done exploring mirror image chemistry and the many advantages, but we should stop short of actually building a mirror image bacteria.
Because it could wipe out life itself?
So I was very skeptical when I first started. People started asking me about this. The more I got into it, the more I read. To me, it was the first time I'd come across anything where biology could even be potentially worse than a nuclear war. So that's why I spent a lot of time working with people on that paper. And there are efforts underway to put policies in place so that we just don't do that.
I have one last question. It's a yes or no question.
Like your first question?
Is life just a coincidence?
Yes and no.
Thank you very much.
It was great talking with you. Thanks for having me.
Great pleasure and also an honor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.